William Ewart Gladstone was the foremost British statesman of the 19th century. He was a member of Parliament for almost continuously 63 years. He entered the cabinet in 1843 and resigned as Prime Minister 51 years later. He served as a cabinet minister under 5 prime ministers and remains the only British Prime Minister to have served for 4 separate terms, resigning finally at the unsurpassed age of 84. Yet there was much more to the man than the politician. He kept a daily diary, which was begun as an evangelical exercise that acted as a substitute for the confessional, and thus included intensely personal entries. The diaries covered a period of over 70 years, from the 16th of July 1825 until his 87th and final birthday, the 29th of December 1896. The diaries reveal much more about the man and about the age, reveal much about the man and about the age he lived in, which is now viewed both as much more complex and much more centered around intellectual and religious issues. I knew the main editor of those diaries into 13 massive volumes, plus the index volume, the late Dr. Colin Matthew. And it was he who calculated that Gladstone read around 100,000 publications across a vast range of subjects during his lifetime. Even in his old age, he would return to Downing Street after late-night parliamentary sittings and read Homer in Greek before retiring to bed in the early hours of the morning. One bibliography of his writing lists 345 titles, including translations and works on the classics and ancient history, on theology and biblical scholarship, on philosophy, on literature, on Ireland, and on economics. It was Sir Robert Peel who gave Gladstone his first ministerial post when he was barely 25. Yet the two men came from strikingly similar backgrounds. Both of them owed their privileged beginnings to their father's successes in accumulating wealth. Neither of them came from old landed aristocracy, although in Gladstone's case, the family did have lands and titles, but several centuries before in Scotland. But from the new wealth, but they both came in real terms from the new wealth engendered by industry, trade, and commerce. Cotton was the source of much of their wealth. The elder Sir Robert Peel has been referred to as the greatest of the early cotton industrialists. Right. William's father, John Gladstone's, amassed a fortune out of several commercial ventures, including cotton plantations in the West Indies. Both fathers became Tory members of Parliament and received baronetcies. Peel and Gladstone, let's say both Gladstone's and Peel's fathers. Peel and Gladstone were both from their family's first generation to attend major public schools. Peel to Harrow and Gladstone to Eton. Both men went up to Oxford, receiving double firsts while at Christ Church. Both men entered Parliament as Tories in their early 20s and progressed towards more liberal positions, not least in economics. Ireland was to mark both their political gravestones. John Gladstone's dropped the final S, changing the family name to Gladstone. William Ewart Gladstone was born in Liverpool on the 29th of December, 1809, at the end of the year that Peel entered Parliament. Gladstone's parents were both Scots, his father Presbyterian, his mother Episcopalian. The family moved to London, to Seaford House in Belgrave Square, and William attended a nearby prep school. At Eton and Oxford, William excelled as a debater, becoming the president of the Oxford Union in 1830. He left Christ Church with a double first in mathematics and classics. Greats. His father's wealth opened all the necessary doors for him. Throughout his life, that inheritance enabled him to live on private capital, which combined with his marriage left him free to pursue his own interests and vocation. His Christian faith was undoubtedly what shaped and challenged his moral and political convictions and goaded him into action. His Episcopalian mother had instilled in him a love of the scripture and a Bible-based Christian faith with some elements of evangelicalism. When he was about 10 years old, she wrote in a letter that William had been truly converted to God. However, he disclaimed his mother's testimony, writing, "Of any true conversion of the heart to God, I do not dare, nor am I confident to speak." Gladstone himself wrote a memorandum on the doctrine of conversion in his 20s. He defined conversion as a turning so far from being the work of a moment that it cannot even be the work of a life. Clearly by then he had no time for any forms of religious enthusiasm that involved ideas of inspiration sudden and sensible, of bodily convulsions, of wild and idle speculations and imaginations. The word sensible did not mean reasonable as it does today, but rather that which sprang from the senses, from feelings and emotions. Gladstone had gone up to Oxford, believing that he was called to the ordained ministry of the Church of England. Gladstone went from Eton to Christ Church, Oxford, and he sat his final exams at Oxford on the morning of the 14th of December, 1831. That afternoon, he received the news of his mathematical first, thus achieving his double first. He packed, said farewells, and caught the night coach down to London. He and his brother set off on the grand tour on the 1st of February, 1832. After 5 days in Belgium, they spent 11 days in Paris, crossed the Alps into Italy, where they were to spend the next 5 years. Gladstone was to visit Italy several times and to become fluent enough in Italian to read Dante and to translate passages from his Divine Comedy. For one from a pronounced Protestant background, his experiences of Roman Catholic countries were to leave profound and mixed impressions upon him. He wrote of his contempt for what he'd observed of the temporal power of the papacy, on his visit to the Papal States. There seems to be every absurdity in the idea of an ecclesiastical sovereign, whether legislative or executive. He continued to believe that the fault for the pain and shame of the schism between the English Reformed Church and the Roman Catholic Church surely rests upon Rome itself. Nevertheless, he attributed to his visit to St. Peter's the first conception of the unity of the Church, acquired, alas, by the existing contrasts and first to be longed for its visible attainment. He hoped that God might bind up the wounds of his bleeding church. He was fascinated by his experiences of Roman Catholic worship. Having attended the Easter benediction at St. Peter's, he recorded, "Nothing could be finer to this scene, to the eyes. Its grandeur transcends everything." He was never to join that church, but remained a faithful Anglican, sorely afflicted by the Romeward departures of friends, family, and friends. 40 years later, he polemically became involved with Cardinal Newman, writing pamphlets on in the wake of the First Vatican Council and the definition of papal infallibility, which his pamphlets denounced Vaticanism and the Vatican decrees in their bearings on civil allegiance. He became a firm high churchman who defended those great Catholic principles which distinguish our church from many other Protestant bodies. On his 23rd birthday, as he prepared to enter Parliament, Gladstone confided a prayer in his journal. May my aim be to cut off every merely selfish appetite and indulgence, and to live with my best energies uniformly and permanently bent towards the great objects for which even I, mean as I am appointed to live, the promotion, O Holy Father, of thy glory and the establishment of thy kingdom upon earth. In old age, Gladstone claimed that he was thrown politically into the anti-liberal attitude by the accident of the Reform Bill of 1831. In a speech to the Oxford Union, he echoed Wellington's claim that such reform would lead to revolution. He wrote of its protagonists as the speakers on the revolutionary side. That speech led the Duke of Newcastle to offer him the nomination of his former pocket borough of Newark. Gladstone entered the first Reformed Parliament as a Tory. He made his maiden speech in the debate on the abolition of slavery, when he defended his father's reputation against the charge of being the murderer of slaves on his estates in the West Indies. Gladstone was always to feel guilty about living off his father's fortune, which was tainted by revenues from the sugar plantations worked by slaves. The scale of the Tory defeat in the election of 1832 was unparalleled until the defeat of John Major's government in 1997. Peel could rely on only 179 out of 658 MPs. As the party recovered and enlarged its representation, Peel sought to attract moderate men to what he renamed the Conservative Party. In the 100 days of Peel's minority administration, Gladstone was appointed briefly as Junior Lord of the Treasury in December 1834 and moved in January to become the Under Secretary of State for War in the Colonies. He was a minister outside of the cabinet. Peel resigned in April 1835, and Gladstone returned with him to the opposition benches. Peel appealed to conservative principles, including an established religion and an imperishable faith, and that established religion shall maintain the doctrines of the Protestant Church. That established church received its last belated defense in Gladstone's The State in its relation with the church. In April and May 1838, the 28-year-old William had attended 3 lectures in London by the Professor of Theology at Edinburgh University, Dr. Thomas Chalmers. Chalmers argued the case for a national establishment of religion. He defined that establishment primarily in terms of endowment. An established church was a church funded by the state. Gladstone found that definition woefully inadequate and set forth to show why he thought so. He maintained that the Church of England had all the marks of the Catholic Church of Christ, so that the state, in rejecting her, would actively violate its most solemn duty and would, if the connection be sound, entail upon itself a curse. He sought to provide a satisfactory intellectual justification by inquiring merely into the grounds and reasons for the alliance and not its terms. The book ranged over a number of interconnected topics, and in the 4th edition grew into 2 volumes. It was in his review of the book in 1839 that Lord Macaulay referred to the 29-year-old Gladstone as the rising hope of those stern, unbending Tories. Gladstone married Katherine Glynn, on the 25th of July, 1839. Born in Harden in Flintshire in 1812, and schooled at home by her mother in literature and foreign languages, while being taught the piano by Franz Liszt. Well connected, she was related to 4 former prime ministers, both the Pitts and the Grenvilles. Her brother introduced Gladstone to her in Rome in 1838. She was to bear him 8 children. She was very supportive of him throughout his career and committed herself to several philanthropic causes. In later life, she suffered from insomnia and loss of memory. Katherine Gladstone died of pneumonia at Harden Castle on the 14th of June, 1900, and was buried 3 days later next to her husband in the double grave at Westminster Abbey, which you will see in the last slide. In the election of 1841, Sir Robert Peel's Conservative Party achieved the first single-party majority in British history. Once in power, Peel disastrously abandoned his efforts to carry the opinion of his party along with him. An historian of the Conservative Party, Robert Blake, concluded, "At a glance, one can see the nature of Tory support. It was overwhelmingly in the counties. The Conservatives won 124 out of 144 seats in the English counties. They have been won on the issues of the defence of the established church and agricultural protection. On both issues, Peel gave his rebels good grounds for sensing betrayal. Peel's government introduced income tax, reviving Pitt's wartime expedient of the property tax. Much later, incidentally, I don't know why I'm repeating myself here, but Gladstone swore his objective, tried to make his objective as Chancellor of the Exchequer to finally get rid of income tax. He didn't succeed. We have it still. It was a temporary measure, and Gladstone was to seek later to abolish it, but it has been there ever since. The budget of 1842 introduced ceilings on duties and revised the sliding scale on corn imports downwards. Over the next 3 years, duties were relaxed and abolished over such a wide range that only the corn laws stood in the way of a full commitment to free trade. Their repeal was to bring down the government and irreparably split the Conservative Party. Gladstone was always to be in the vanguard of those changes. He became Vice President of the Board of Trade in September 1841 and entered the cabinet in May 1843 as President of the Board of Trade. He demonstrated his commitment there to free trade and the politics of laissez-faire. In 1845, Peel faced a serious revolt over the grant to the Roman Catholic Seminary in Maynooth. Pitt had introduced it 50 years before. I think I actually got a slide of that. Sorry, let's do it that way around. Had introduced it 50 years earlier to gain support from Roman Catholic hierarchy in his stand against revolutionary and radical causes. It was to be renewed. It was renewed annually by Parliament. Peel and the Cabinet decided not only to increase it substantially, but also to make it permanent without an annual vote. This issue sparked off a wave of anti-Catholicism. Its opponents argued that by making the grant permanent, the state was introducing a form of dual endowment in Ireland. Gladstone resigned from the cabinet because of the bill's inconsistency with the position that he had expressed in the state in its relation to the church. However, he showed his movement from that earlier position by voting for the permanent grant. The issue of religious freedom and pluralism became one of the key ingredients in his gradual conversion from Toryism to liberalism. At the end of his life, Gladstone reflected, "I was brought up to dislike and distrust liberty. I learned to believe in it. That is the key to all my changes." The establishment of a Roman Catholic hierarchy with assumed jurisdictions caused yet another eruption of anti-Catholicism and the charges of papal aggression. Russell's government sought to restrict its implementation in the Ecclesiastical Titles Bill of 1851 by declaring illegal any further episcopal creations by the papacy. Gladstone opposed the bill and posed a question to the House of Commons. Will you go forwards in the career of religious freedom? He wrote to the Primus, the senior bishop of the Scottish Episcopal Church, "Away with the servile doctrine that religion cannot live but by the aid of the state. Only," he argued, "with full religious freedom brings out into full vigor, and also into fair and impartial rivalry, the internal energies of each communion, so that they stand upon their merits before the world. The bill passed into law, but Gladstone, as Prime Minister, was to repeal it 20 years later. With the fall of Peel, the Conservative Party split into two groups. The protectionist majority accepted the leadership of Stanley, and from 1847, in the House of Commons of Benjamin Disraeli. They, however, abandoned protectionism in 1851. And there was no major divisive issue until the death of Palmerston in 1865 reopened the real prospect of parliamentary reform that I shall look at in a later lecture. Peel himself remained aloof and a lonely figure until his death in 1850. For those of you who are aware of the situation here in Britain 20, 30 years ago, or say 30 or 40 years ago, he sat rather like Edward Heath on a bench all on his own, separate from the supporters of Margaret Thatcher in those days. So he sat alone until his death in 1850. In September 1846, Gladstone remarked characteristically, Peel remarked characteristically, "I intend to keep aloof from party combinations." His supporters became known as Peelites. Their numerical strength remains a matter of historical debate. In reality, they were a very loose group that disagreed among themselves on important issues. As the Whig MP George Cornwallis Lewis commented in 1849, "The Peelites are small in their numbers, but divided among themselves." Gladstone remarked, "We have no party, no organization, no whipping in." All the major figures in Peel's cabinet became Peelites except Stanley, who became the acknowledged leader of the Conservative rump. He became the 14th Earl of Derby in 1851. All the opposition parties, including the Peelites, combined to defeat Disraeli's budget and brought into down Derby's first minority government in 1852. When Aberdeen formed his cabinet, he brought in 5 fellow Peelites, 6 Whigs, and 1 Radical. Disraeli referred to them as a band of self-educated geniuses. Gladstone turned down an offer of a cabinet post from Derby in 1858, admitting to a strong sense of revulsion from Disraeli personally. The personal animosity between Gladstone and Disraeli, incidentally shown in the together sort of pulled arms apart, social distancing in the on the right of your screen, in the Punch cartoon. That personal animosity prevented any possible rapprochement between these two groups. Gladstone assumed Peel's mantle and never forgave Disraeli for his betrayal. He had contempt for the unscrupulousness and second-mindedness of Disraeli. An anti-Tory combination brought down Derby's second government. The Whigs still relied on the support of the Irish and Radical MPs. The Liberal Party grew out of the coalition of Whigs, Liberals, and Radicals in Palmerston's second government of 1859. Clarendon called that administration a great bundle of sticks. Out of office after the fall of Peel, William had become Chancellor of the Exchequer in Aberdeen's Whig-Peelite coalition in December 1852. His 3 budgets abolished duties on 123 articles and reduced them on 133 more. He introduced a scheme to reduce the national debt. He resigned in 1855 rather than serve under Palmerston, whose foreign policy he deplored. From November 1858 until the following March, he was the High Commissioner to the Ionian Islands. I should point out that Gladstone was one of those who opposed the war against Russia in the Crimea. Gladstone, but once the government had gone into it, of course, he had to loyally stand beside the government on that. Gladstone was one with Palmerston in his support for Italian unification. He became Palmerston's Chancellor of the Exchequer in June 1859 and held that office for the next 7 years. Gladstone maintained that it was not good for government to interfere in the economy more than was absolutely necessary. National prosperity was dependent on economic freedom. The government's role in the economy was merely to promote the best conditions for free enterprise, and therefore it should not impose unnecessary restrictions. Governments must seek to reduce the tax burden by economizing, thereby reducing and limiting public expenditure so that whatever service should be performed for the public should be executed in the most efficient manner, but likewise at the lowest practical cost. The commercial treaty with France and the abolition of the paper duties demonstrated his continued commitment to free trade. His repeal of the paper duties bill was pursued in the face of opposition from the Prime Minister and most of the Cabinet. Confronted by a very adverse House, the bill only scraped through the Commons to be rejected by a narrow majority in the House of Lords. Gladstone then confronted the Lords with a single bill, which included the repeal of the paper duties and the reduction of income tax. By so doing, the Lords could only accept or reject the whole budget. Rejection would have caused a constitutional crisis. Thus, he introduced the first single omnibus budget in 1861, which has been the practice ever since. His red box, which I should have found a picture of for this, was in continuous use on budget day and until almost the end of the 20th century, when Gordon Brown replaced the battered relic with his new shining contribution to cool Britannia. The young Gladstone had referred to the Reform Act of 1832 as Antichrist, and yet by the 1860s, he firmly supported a further extension of the vote to a select portion of the working class. Maybe I could just take a break for a moment and let you read those quotations, but I will bring them up again in my talk on the age of reform, but do have a look at them for a moment and then I'll continue in a minute. In a speech of 1844, he asked those questions. What are the qualities which fit a man for the exercise of the franchise? His answer was self-command, self-control, respect for order, patience under suffering, confidence in the law, regard for superiors. The vote remained a privilege to be earned and merited. Gladstone had been impressed by the responsible attitude of the new model unions, which we looked at the other week, or several weeks ago actually, which had concentrated on conciliation and arbitration rather than confrontation, while establishing friendly societies to encourage skilled workers, artisans, in financial prudence of thrift and self-help. He had come to regard such artisans as morally entitled to come within the pale of the Constitution. He went on to introduce with Russell the Reform Bill of 1866. It brought down the government, and yet it was a much more cautious bill than the Conservatives' Reform Act of the following year. Gladstone's second administration was to introduce the third Reform Bill, which became the Third Reform Act. The Liberals won a decisive victory in 1868, and Gladstone was asked to form his first government. Palmerston's preoccupation with foreign affairs had left a backlog of domestic matters demanding legislation. Palmerston had come to realize that Gladstone was destined to lead his party. Gladstone will soon have it all his own way, and whenever he gets my place, we shall have strange doings. Oh, sorry, I think I've got these in the moment. No, yep, come back in there. Gladstone's was the first great reforming ministry within which he gave much latitude to individual ministers because of his belief in collective responsibility. John Bright looked back in 1873 on its first 5 years as memorable years, in which great principles, I will actually that one for a minute, in which great principles were established, and its measures will bear comparison with those of any government which has preceded it. At the core of Gladstone's liberalism was a belief in merit rather than equality, an unearned privilege or unearned privilege. Drawing on his immense knowledge of the classical world, he proclaimed, "I am a firm believer in the aristocratic principle, the rule of the best." In his administration, he brought about a number of institutional reforms based on merit and therefore on efficiency rather than privilege. I apologize, I've got these in the wrong order, I do apologize. Okay, the 1847 Reform Act made it necessary to provide education for the newly enfranchised. The purpose of the Education Act of 1870 was to fill the gaps and cover the country with good schools. The army was in urgent need of reform. The grossly inefficient conduct of the Crimean War contrasted with the mechanical perfection of the Prussian army in its 3 lightning wars of German unification. The purchase of commissions was abolished, and promotion was henceforth to be based entirely on merit. Entrance into the civil service was still based on connections and contact with someone who knew of a vacancy. The reforms of the Indian civil service in the 1850s introduced entrance by compulsory examination. Gladstone defended the principle that first appointments to the civil service are to be regulated by open competition. The reform was implemented by Orders in Council. The same principle was extended to university appointments. The religious tests which barred non-Anglicans were abolished. The formation of trade unions was put on a legal footing, and they were allowed to register and organize strikes. Under pressure, Gladstone allowed an amending act which effectively illegalized picketing. For elections, he ended open voting and replaced it with a secret ballot. Polling booths were to be set up in each constituency. The Corrupt and Illegal Practice Act, the Third Reform Act, and the Redistribution Act were passed during his second administration. And I shall say more of that when I look at the age of reform. In a speech in Manchester in 1872, Benjamin Disraeli affirmed that England was a great country, an imperial country, and the second great object of the Tory party was to uphold the Empire of England. Therefore, no minister in this country will do his duty who neglects any opportunity of reconstructing as much as possible of our colonial empire. Such an imperial policy required a vigorous and interventionist foreign policy, which Disraeli pursued in government between 1874 and 1880. The cardinal responsibility of British governments was to defend the frontiers of British rule in India, with land and sea routes from her, especially after the acquisition of the Suez Canal. Disraeli's Royal Titles Act made Victoria the Empress of India in 1877, and 3/4 of her subjects were now living in the Indian subcontinent. In return, Victoria made Disraeli the Earl of Beaconsfield. Punch published a cartoon of them graciously exchanging crowns. That's right. Sorry. Disraeli followed Palmerston's policy in relation to the Eastern question. Palmerston and Disraeli sought to prop up the Turkish Empire, which they saw in great danger of impending collapse. This would enable Russian influence to grow into the Mediterranean, the Balkans, and the Middle East, thus endangering the security of India. Gladstone believed that Britain should not intervene. He was appalled by Disraeli's policy of supporting Turkey and disregarding the atrocities against her subject peoples that we looked at in a previous talk. There is not a cannibal in the South Seas islands whose indignation would not arise and overboil at the recital of that which has been done. Let the Turks now carry away their abuses in the only possible manner, namely by carrying off of themselves. Gladstone rejected Disraeli's narrow, restless, blustering, and self-assertive foreign policy, appealing to self-love and the pride of community, which turned national interest into a new and baseless idolatry. His assault on what he called Beaconsfieldism formed the central plank of his famous campaign of 1879. Gladstone was the first party leader to take his case personally to the people, storming across the country in railway trains. He undertook a heavy schedule of speeches, public engagements, and railway journeys, especially for a man now in his 70th year. Gladstone was not an absolute non-interventionist, but he was a reluctant one. Gladstone saw the need for action where British interests were directly concerned or threatened, especially where inaction would mean enlarging British commitments. He regarded Disraeli's expansionism as a costly folly and an unnecessary drain on government finances. I seem to have got these out of order, I'm sorry. In 1878, his article on England's mission was published in the 19th century. Gladstone held that it was already clearly proven that the cares and calls of the British Empire are already beyond the strength of those who govern and have governed it. He argued that Britain had undertaken far more in government responsibilities than had ever been attempted previously in history. 2 years later, Disraeli left Gladstone a legacy of entanglements, trouble, and wars in Egypt, Sudan, South Africa, and Afghanistan. This seriously impaired the work of his second administration and ultimately led to its downfall. For Gladstone, it was essential to maintain good government at home and to avoid needless entanglements and engagements. He believed that Christians should aim to preserve the nations of the world the blessings of peace. These were 3 of his 6 right principles of foreign policy. He failed in his second ministry to uphold another, the sound principle to keep the powers of Europe in union together. His 5th principle was to acknowledge the equal rights of all nations. And the 6th is that the foreign policy of England should always be inspired by a love of freedom. Gladstone had made many visits to Italy, a country which he loved and continued to be fascinated by. On his way back from the Ionian Islands in 1850, he was shocked by what he found in Naples, still ruled at that point by a Spanish Bourbon king, Ferdinand II, who had cut back on the concessions forced on him by the revolution 2 years earlier. Gladstone described the way the king treated his subject peoples as a negation of God erected into a system of government. His observations in Italy affected his views on Ireland, whose people were the subjects of Queen Victoria. He made it his mission to pacify Ireland. He came to uphold the rights of small nations and subject peoples to justice and, in some cases, self-determination. His commitment to the pursuit of a fair and just solution to the Irish problem led him ultimately to accept the principle of home rule for Ireland and to sacrifice his political career and party for that cause. The basic religious grievance of the Roman Catholic majority was that they were required by law to pay tithes, 1/10 of their income, and the value of their produce to the Anglican Church. This was ended by Gladstone's act to disestablish and disendow the Church of Ireland in 1869. Gladstone's first Land Act established that no tenant could be evicted if rent was paid on time, and that at the end of the lease, he was to be compensated for improvements. And the House of Lords severely mauled that bill and rendered it largely ineffectual. The widespread violence that followed necessitated a Coercion Act. Gladstone's second Land Act of 1881 met the basic demands for land reform, but by then the Home Rule movement had gained considerable momentum, and it was quite simply too little, too late. Gladstone had already conceded the possibility of some form of devolution. As Peel's colonial secretary, Gladstone had become convinced of eventual self-government as the destiny of colonies. Gladstone's 3rd and 4th terms as Prime Minister were cut short by the failure of the Home Rule Bills of 1886 and 1893, which aimed to provide Ireland with a qualified form of self-government, or what we would now call devolution. In 1892, the Liberals came back on a widespread and radical manifesto, but Gladstone was determined that Home Rule should be the top priority. The second Home Rule Bill passed through the Commons, only to be rejected by the Lords by an overwhelming majority on the 1st of September 1893. That drove Gladstone to recommend the reform of the House of Lords. Throughout the 19th century, the Lords had never rejected a Tory or Conservative measure, but have frequently rejected or amended Whig and Liberal ones. A final row erupted in Cabinet over naval estimates. Gladstone went to Biarritz, and on his return, called a meeting of the Cabinet on the 1st of March 1894. If you like, in the questions, I've got a rather amusing anecdote about the centenary of that date. He told them of his intentions to resign. He was already 2 months into his 85th year, and his oversight was deteriorating from cataracts. He retired at last to Harden Castle, the estate in Flintshire, and just across the border into Wales, left to him by his wife's family in 1852 on the death of his brother-in-law, Sir Stephen Glynn. Some word of explanation about those photographs, which I took when Patty and I were there in 1986, I think. And I rang up Sir William Gladstone the night before and got permission to visit Gladstone. I'm going to refer to the Temple of Peace, his study, the following day, and there I am being brought out of it by the librarian. Unfortunately, I didn't take any photographs of it, but the estate is wonderful, actually. It's a beautiful place, not open generally to the public, but because it's still owned by the family. And there it is in the 20th century, and here it is in a part of illustrations published shortly after Gladstone's own death in 1898. And it shows you the views of the house from 4 different angles. The estate provided him with ample opportunity for his recreational pursuit of chopping down trees. I should have added there's a photograph in that collection of his axes, but I didn't bring it in. He worked on his study called the Temple of Peace, and built an oratory, a sort of, it's a octagonal sort of building in which he practiced his speeches. I've been in it. It actually works, even for me, let alone for him. Gladstone edited a new edition of Butler's Analogy and Sermons, providing a companion volume to his study subsidiary to the works of that philosopher of religion of the 18th century, who had been one of his major mentors. He had time now to devote to assembling some autobiographica, to enjoy family life surrounded by his grandchildren, and to take holidays abroad with his wife. And there's the pictures, 19th century, obviously contemporaneous photographs of him in it and of the Temple of Peace, his study, which looks remarkably much the same certainly when I visited in the 1980s. Gladstone had written his private diary daily for 70 years. He deliberately brought it to a conclusion on 29th of December 1896, his 87th birthday. My long and tangled life this day concludes his 87th year. My father died 4 days short of that term. The blessings of family life continued to be poured out upon my unworthy head. Still, old age is appointed for the gradual loosening and successive snapping of the threads. You can see various rooms in the interior here, the library, the dining room, the drawing room, and there's a picture of a great meeting. It's actually a fete, which they held in the grounds every year, and there's the Gladstones arriving, and he then, of course, gave the huge gathering a speech. And I can mention to you, because Roy Jenkins actually spoke about this, how in fact the speeches without microphones were relayed to vast crowds of thousands of people. But I'll come back to that another time later. March 1898. I've almost finished, by the way. Cancer of the palate was diagnosed while he was in Bournemouth. Gladstone signals the intention to die at his beloved Harden. He suffered a protracted and painful period awaiting his release. The Bishop of St. Andrews administered communion to him for the last time on Friday in Passion Week 1898. Gladstone had been ordered to stay in bed. The bishop recalled, "Out of his bed he came. Alone he knelt in the presence of his God, till the absolution had been spoken and the sacred elements received." Gladstone died peacefully and calmly on Ascension Day, May the 18th, 1898. News of his death brought a flood of tributes from friend and foe alike. The House of Commons was adjourned, as was the Oxford Union. He was awarded a state funeral, which outside of the royal family was on a par only with that of Wellington and Churchill. 250,000 people passed by his body as he lay in state in Westminster Abbey. The Conservative Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, himself a pawnbroker, had risen in the House of Lords to pay tribute to his last great political opponent. Looking back on Gladstone, his long career and public service, Salisbury identified both the reason for the outpouring of grief and tributes, and also the kernel of his greatness. And with this, I end. There's something I wanted to add on at the end, but I'll try and find it while we're talking, which is actually a recording of his voice and a film of his funeral. But I'll try and do that during the discussion at some point. Salisbury's tribute. What is the cause of this universal feeling, unanimous feeling? This was his opponent, of course. What is the cause of this unanimous feeling? It was an account of considerations more common to the masses of human beings, to the general working of the human mind, than any controversial questions of the policy that men recognized in him a man guided in all steps he took and in all the efforts that he made by a high moral ideal. What he sought were the attainments of great ideals, and they could have issued from nothing but the greatest and purest moral aspirations. And he is honored by his countrymen because through so many years, across so many vicissitudes and conflicts, they recognize this one characteristic of his actions, which has never ceased to be felt. He will leave behind him the memory of a great Christian statesman, set up necessarily on high. The sight of his character, his motives, and his intention would strike all the world. They will have left a deep and most salutary influence on the political thought and the social thought of the generation in which he lived. And he will be long remembered, not so much for the issues in which he was engaged or the political projects which he favored, but as an example in which history hardly furnishes a parallel of a great Christian man. Thank you.